move towards the poem, first of all, I wanted to discuss types of poetry with you. So, what do you understand? How many types of poetry are there? Anyone?
Ma'am, there are a number of types of poetry like ghazal, uh, we can say in Urdu, क्या कहें, मसनवी, ghazal, rubai. There are a number of types.
Very good. Someone else? Have you ever heard of classification of poetry?
मैम, पोइट्री एक क्लासिकल पोइट्री होती है, एक जो जदीद जो हमारे शोरा जो अब इस टाइम के वक्त जो शायरी कर रहे होते हैं, एक वो होती है जो जदीद क्लासिकल पोइट्री, वो होती है जो हमारे कदीम शोरा ने उन्होंने जो पोइट्री की होती है, और वो ऐसी होती है जो इस वक्त भी काम आ रही होती है। लोग दिल से और उसको पढ़ते हैं, मतलब वो इस टाइम भी कारआमद है वो पोइट्री।
Very good, Ghulam Ali. You are absolutely right. We can divide poetry into various forms. Okay, so according to different features, we can divide poetry into different forms. So, let's say, for example, this is one way in which we divide poetry according to the time. Okay, and the techniques that are used in Sindhi and Urdu. We also say Uruzi and Gair Uruzi Shairi. But there would be other ways and other features according to which we can divide poetry. So, here we are talking about two general areas in which we have divided poetry in English. One is lyrical poetry, and other we have is narrative poetry. Okay, so do you have any idea what is lyrical poetry and what is narrative poetry? Anyone? Okay, so basically, lyrical poetry is a short, non-narrative poem, okay, in which a single speaker presents his state of mind or emotional state. So the generally short poems that we read, they would fall under the category of lyrical poetry. But when we understand narrative poetry, basically narrative poetry is a, like, they give a verbal presentation, and basically the narrative poetry is a form of poetry. Like previously, nowadays we have more of lyrical poetry, but people used to write books. Okay, books on narrative poetry. Like maybe they kind of want to tell a story, and it also has a proper plot. Okay, so they would write whole long books. So when you go to archaic works like Tennyson's Maud or Wordsworth's works, so you'll find a lot of narrative poetry because they will write volumes of books on poetry, and that particular poetry or that particular book, that would have a particular plot. Okay, and there would be connected events, and there would be people in their poetry, and they would verbally tell and talk on that particular topic. Okay, so that type of poetry, which is long and which gives us a verbal representation in the form of verse, and there is a sequence of events. Okay, so there are connected events which form a plot, and it is always told by a narrator. So there is some person who narrates the story, who narrates that poetry. So that is the form of poetry which is narrative. Okay, so there are some examples of narrative poetry here. And other type of poetry which is not narrative, okay, in which there is no proper plot, or there is there is not a narrative or no verbal expression, that is a lyric poetry. So that is comparatively short, non-narrative, in which a single speaker presents a state of mind or an emotional state. So all the types of poetry, for example, ghazal and other poetries that we usually see in our context, the short poems in which we are talking about the poet shares their feelings or emotions, that would be generally categorized as lyric poetry. Then we have so many categories for poems which could be categorized under lyrical poetry. I hope it's clear. Okay.
मैम
Yes,
नैरेटिव
Ghulam Ali.
समझ नहीं आया थोड़ा।
मैं मैम
Yes, ma'am.
मतलब ये कि जो गजल है मैम, जो गजल है वो नैरेटिव स्टोरी है, उसके अलावा जो नज़म है वो लिरिकल है। नहीं, वो तो नैरेटिव है, और जो गजल है वो है लिरिकल। ऐसे, क्योंकि उसके अंदर प्लॉट नहीं है गजल के अंदर, वो क्योंकि हर शेर का मुख्तलिफ ख्याल होता है, और जबकि जो नज़म होती है उसके अंदर एक ही ख्याल लास्ट तक चलता है।
I'm not sure about what you call a nazam. ठीक है, लेकिन when we are talking about short poems जिसमें author is sharing about their emotions or their state of mind, वो अपने perspective से कोई चीज discuss कर रहे हैं, that would be a lyrical poem. So ghazal for sure would be a lyrical poem because the poet is expressing their feelings. Okay, so when we have a proper plot and a narrator is narrating a poetry, okay, and there is a verbal expression, that would be narrative poetry. We'll discuss the subcategories of narrative poetry so it would be more clear. Okay, so I hope lyric is clear so far. So subcategories are elegy, ode, sonnet, that we have already talked about sonnet, dramatic monologue. Okay, so even when the dramas were written, so there were verses or poetry used in between. So those monologues in which one person was reading that poetry, that would also be lyric poetry because that is not a comprehensive plot, it's just a monologue. Okay, in modern usage, elegy is a formal lament for a death of a particular person. Elegy को जैसे हम लोग मर्सिया कहते हैं ना, so when we are writing a poetry for the death of someone or to express sadness, okay, so in that case we would say it's a elegy. Very good, Dua. These are some of the types of poetry. Okay, um, so we have some examples. Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard. So this is an English poem that is a form of elegy. Also, we have Tennyson's In Memoriam. So it was written uh, as a form of elegy to talk about the death. Then we also have Ode. Ode is comparatively long lyrical poem. Okay, usually we know lyrics are short, but again, Ode would not be as long as a narrative poem. It's a long lyric poem with a serious subject. So there would be a particular topic. Okay, the way Gulamari you were mentioning about a nazam, so it would again have a subject but not a plot. Okay, so ode is a long lyric poem with a serious subject written in an elevated style. Okay, so Wordsworth hymn, that is an ode, a hymn to duty, it's an ode. So there's a particular subject and it's written in elevated style. Then we have a sonnet that we have already talked about and its origin. And these are some writers. So sonnet is basically a 14-line poem. Okay, it deals with the lover suffering in hopes, but that we cannot specify it. What was the sonnet about that we read? Shakespeare's sonnet. What was it talking about? Anyone?
मैम वो एक दरख्त था ना, जो एक वो अपने ख्याल बता रहा था कि मैं जब यंग था उस टाइम क्या था, उसके अलावा अब मेरी एज जो बढ़ रही है, उसके अलावा मैं बूढ़ा होता जा रहा हूँ, इसके हवाले से वो कह रहा
Okay,
था।
very good. Very good. Someone else? Someone from microbiology?
Ma'am, he was describing about his
adulthood
Okay.
and childhood.
Okay, very good. So he was talking about his age, the process of aging and death. Okay, so that was one of the sonnet, and he was talking about kind of his sufferings and what he hoped from his life. And he was saying that after he dies, the people would get closer to him and like remember him more. So that could be one way. And usually, when we talk about sonnet, we talk about 49 poem. Okay, so it originated in Italy and and became proper in England in the Renaissance when Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey translated. So these are some poets who wrote sonnet. All you have to remember for now is that a sonnet is a 14-line poem. Okay, and ode is a long lyrical poetry. Elegy is a poetry written in a formal lament for the death. Then we have a dramatic monologue, a speaker who is explicitly someone other than the author. Okay, makes a speech to a silent auditor in a specific situation and at a critical moment. So, in a drama, other than the author himself, someone would read some poetry, okay, to an auditor in the drama. So, that would be a dramatic monologue. So, here is an example, okay, in Robert Browning's My Last Touches, for instance, the Duke shows the picture of his last wife to Mishri from his prospective new wife and reveals his excessive pride in his position and his jealous temperament. So he might have, I haven't read the book, but I can say that he might have read some poetry, and that was the dramatic monologue. Then we also have occasional poetry. It is written for a specific occasion, okay, maybe some kind of a celebration or any particular occasional poetry that would be called occasional poetry. And there would be so many subcategories under it. There would be other forms of poetry, but these are some very common ones and very generalized ones. Okay, then we have narrative poetry. There are different forms of narrative poetry. Ballad, as Dua already told us. We have epics. Epics usually operate on a large scale, both in length and topic. Since epic is a narrative poetry, so it is going to be large in length as well as topic, such as founding of a nation. Okay, so it will talk about all the events that led to the foundation establishment of a nation or the beginning of world history. So you would see the topic is itself so comprehensive as well as the way it would be written would be so long and lengthy. Milton's Paradise Lost. They tend to use an elevated style of language and supernatural beings taking part in the action. Okay. Then we have mock epics. So they make use of epic conventions like the elevated style and the assumption that the topic is of great importance to deal with completely insignificant occurrences. Okay, so they would choose topic they would assume that the topic is of great importance and deal with completely insignificant occurrences. So that is called an mock epic. So that would be again a form of epic, but since it would be dealing with insignificant occurrences, it would be called mock epic. Then we have a ballad. Ballad is basically a song which is sung occasionally, transmitted originally transmitted orally, okay, which tells a story. So ballad is basically a song and it tells us a story. So these are few very common types of poetry. Then we have descriptive and didactic poetry. Basically, didactic we mean any works which are written to teach something, okay, or give a moral lesson. Those tarah ki poetry, then we couldn't categorize it under. But that could again be narrative or lyric. So we are not going in that detail. Okay, so these are very few common types of poems. If you have any question.